Welcome to Small Talk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of Small Talk, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Shimon Szimonowitz, who is the Reish Machon Alizayas and the Rav of Pine River Village, Sfard, in Lakewood. And this time we'll be discussing the new edition of the Sefer Koran Pnei Moshe, which is a super commentary, if you will, a commentary on the Pirush Ramban on Chumash. And this was written by Moshe Greenis. It was out of print for many years. It was actually 2 volumes. He, I think, published the first one many years ago, and then the second volume was published later after he was nifter. And then now it's put together in one big new volume, completely redone. So thank you, Rabbi Shimon, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me. I feel almost like a regular over here.
What can you tell the listeners about this Sefer, Koran Pnei Moshe?
So I have to make sure when I answer these questions, I don't sound like I say that about every single Sefer, the same thing, that this is the best Sefer ever. But the truth of the matter is that we don't just discuss every single Sefer that comes out of Machon Alizayis. We do like 15, 25 titles a week. And as often as you guess, think I'm on this, what do you call it? Podcast. I don't want to say a show. Often as the guests think I'm here, we do actually only choose few and far between Svarim that we discuss. And the Sefer Koran Pnei Moshe we've been discussing for months already, that we have to have a discussion about it. It is a very, very unique Sefer, and something personal, which I don't think I've said about other Svarim. I literally use a Sefer every single week. I give a share every week on Ramban, Shabbos morning, and every single week I sit down with the Sefer and look what he says about the Ramban, and I never am disappointed with what he writes. It's an amazing Sefer on the Ramban. It's not on every piece of Ramban. It's not like you have the whole Ramban with a running notes on the Ramban. He picks certain pieces of the Ramban, which he has a very honest and a thorough discussion of taking apart every word in the Ramban and explaining. He can sometimes just discuss a certain point the Ramban's making, explaining the Ramban, but there's always something new while he's remaining honest and true to the real pshat in the Ramban.
Yeah, and this is something that you've been telling me about this for a while. I think even when you started this project, that this is such a chashva sefer, and we're going to have to do a podcast on it. Then it came out, we have to get to it. And I knew about the sefer for a while also because the son of the Mechaber, Reb Chaim Greenis, is often in my neighborhood. His son-in-law, Meir Lebkovsky, lives on my block, so he was telling me about the sefer, and actually Reb Chaim is quite a knowledgeable person as well. So I knew of the sefer, but it wasn't until I actually saw it. It wasn't around, and I didn't actually see it, so then I actually saw it, and it's quite an interesting sefer, as we're going to get into here. So let's start off. Tell the listeners about this sefer.
So I just want to comment what you said about Reb Chaim Greenis, and the same thing is true about his brother. Both of them are also a bit of mechabrim of the Sefer, because the father had a lot of dialogue with his sons in learning, and he quotes them often. There are even letters back and forth with his sons, and he quotes them. So you can consider Reb Chaim and his brother actually also co-authors of the Sefer.
So let's start off with Moshe Greenis. Tell the listeners a little bit about him and his biography, his background.
So he grew up in America. He was born in 1923. He learned in Chaim Berlin. And this is the pre-Rav Hutner days of Chaim Berlin. When Rav Hutner came, Rav Hutner joined Chaim Berlin and became the dean of the yeshiva. And he was first Rabbi Greenis' 9th grade Rebbe, and then he moved up from 9th grade to 10th grade. He became his 10th grade Rebbe, and 11th grade Rebbe, 12th grade Rebbe. He kept on moving up Rav Hutner. So Rav Hutner was his Rebbe for many years. In the 8th grade, he actually valued a lot his relationship, and he considered himself a Talmud of Rav Meir Pam, who's the father of the famous Rav Abram Pam. And he also learned over there by Rav Yaakov Moshe Shurkin. So he had these Chashav Rabbeim. There's interesting that being in Chaim Berlin back in those days, so Chaim Berlin wasn't what Chaim Berlin is today, super Haredi yeshiva. What Chaim Berlin then was, there were a lot of these old Volozhina Talmidim who were the Malamdim in the Cheder, and they had a very strong background in Mikra. Interestingly enough, even though the Volozhina Talmidim, they knew how to learn a Blat Gemara, but they were Bali Mikra. And that is, you can credit Rabbi Greenis' strong background in Mikra. He had a very, very solid background in Mikra. The whole Sefer is based on that. And that goes back to his early chinuch in Chaim Berlin. I don't know if we should say this or not, but it happens to be that I've heard from other Anashim Gedolim who learned in Chaim Berlin back in the day. Again, this is a pre-Rav Hutner days. And in those days, the Malamdim weren't exactly the biggest Yorei Shemayim. Some of them were able to recite Bialik from their co-alumni, from alumnus from Chaim Berlin.
From Volozhin.
From Volozhin. There's been a little bit of buzz about this book, The Memories of Two Generations, The Yiddish Life in Russia and Texas by Alexander Z. Gurwitz. You're familiar with the book, right?
Published by, I think, Alabama University Press.
Right.
It.
So I was intrigued. Someone told me it's a great book. You get a little memoir about to see someone who was a Volozhin, a Talmud, who came to the United States, and he became a Melamed in America. And I was intrigued, so I started reading the book. And then I realized that this book is an English translation of the original Yiddish. So I might as well read it in the original Yiddish, which is free of charge. You can download it online for free. And it's interesting that this gives you a little picture of the kind of Melamed that you might have had in Chaim Berlin. He seems to have been a Shomer Torah mitzvahs most of his life. This Rabbi Hurwitz of these memoirs, but he does admit that at the end of his life he lived very far from shul, so someone would give him a ride to shul on Shabbos. So you get the kind of picture of what a Melamed Tinoikis, who was originally Volozhin Talmud, might have looked like in those years. Just a Maimer Hamuzger. I don't know if this is not relevant to that discussion at all, but I happen to have mentioned this book. I want to mention some things that how you have to be careful when you read translations. The translator who wrote the English version, the academic version, and the University Press published of the Memories of Two Generations of this, it's edited by Brian Edward Stone and translated. The translation was written years before it was found, and then this editor who doesn't even read Yiddish was the one who edited it and published it. But if you read the original Yiddish, some very funny things happen. I'll give you two examples of some interesting things that things get lost in translation. It's important to know for people who look at translation and don't see the original. So he has a good sense of humor, this Horowitz, and he writes how he came to the Cheder. It's back in Europe when he was a child going to Cheder, and he wants to describe what kind of house his Melamed had. So he writes that the Mizrach wall in his house is given verschmutzt mit von Fliegen. It means it was dirty from flies. He says, you see from here that upon him, he says, Fliegen haben euch lieb zu sitzen Mizrach seid. The flies also like to be on the Mizrach. It's a Yiddish joke that, the Rabbanim used to like to go to the Mizrach wall. People would pay a lot of money to go to the Mizrach Wand. So he says the flies also haben sich besetzt of the Mizrach Wand. And if you look at the English version, it says, on one wall, there hung a large picture with the word Mizrach prominently displayed. This indicated the wall faced eastward towards Jerusalem, thus the proper direction facing when praying. Under the word Mizrach, there were portrayed two fierce lions. And then he says, the Mizrach picture, traditional in every Jewish home then, was heavily overladen with dust and fly specks. Apparently, flies also like to face Jerusalem. So that's totally missing the point. It's that flies like the Mizrach Wand, not that flies like to face Jerusalem. Another interesting thing, how things can get lost in translation, just to give you another example, then we go back to our topic, and is that he mentions how his Melamed didn't know how to teach. So there's a different instance, many chapters later. So he says they're learning Pashas Tazria, and the Rebbe comes in and he says, Isha an Isha, Kisazria, sie wird Mazria sein, Yoldon, sie wird Moiled sein, Zocher a Zocher, Tmei soll sein Tombes. He's not teaching anything, he's just saying the same thing again and again. But if you look at the English version of that same story, the whole thing gets lost. He writes in English, and there's many examples, I'm just giving you two examples of this. He says, he opened his Bible and began to recite the first sentence of the portion we were to study. Isha, a woman, Kisazria, when she is delivered, V'yolda, and she has a Zochar, a male child, V'tameh, and she shall be unclean. Oh, that's perfect. The Rebbe did a great job. He missed the whole point that he wasn't translating anything. So that's just a good example of that book. But I just mentioned it because this Gurwitz gives us a very clear depiction of what it was like to be a Melamed, originally Volozhin Talmud, and he writes about his encounter within a Tziv, and at the same time, he, at the end of his life, was allowing someone to drive him to shul on Shabbos. And this is the kind of upbringing Rabbi Greenis had in Chaim Berlin. But at the same time, there were very chashuva people there who were mashpia on him, like Moshe Shmuel Shapiro, not to be confused with Moshe Shmuel Shapiro from Ber Yankiv. He was Malamed, or maybe Manal, in Chaim Berlin at the time, and Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Shurkin, Rabbi Meir of Pam. But ultimately, Rav Hutner steps in, and that's when he joins Rav Hutner. He later on became a Magachir in the yeshiva, and then in 1966 he left the yeshiva entirely and he got a stellar elsewhere. That's basically his history.
So just to mention about the Memoirs of Two Generations, The Yiddish Life in Russia and Texas, Alexander Z. Gurwitz, published by University of Alabama Press. You can find it on Amazon. It's about $35 or so. I actually didn't read it, so I think now that you're talking about it, I think I should read it. Obviously, Fear highly recommended it to me and to many. I think he was posting about it back on Twitter back in the day. So this is it's quite an interesting book, and this is something that you see of in translation. You're involved in the book publishing world, and this is what happens when you get published books. I mean, it brings to mind I did an episode a number of years ago with Sarah Rieger about the book that she published for her father's thing, and they have the Short Tam or Short Mood. That's the one that comes to mind.
That's the daughter of that's the granddaughter of the Briskadayan of Rabbi.
Yeah, Rabbi Chazal Rieger, and what she one of the things is that she talks about Shor Tam and Shor Muad. She wrote the holiday acts and acts of the fool. I mean, it's just this is one of the examples throughout the book. But this is what happens when there's lost in translation or you don't understand the point. But okay, at least it's available in English translation. Okay, now back to the Koran Pnei Moshe as we were talking about. But again, usually you bring out the point of Chaim Berlin. So. This Moshe Green's Koran Pnei Moshe was the old type of Chaim Berlin. He was in Chaim Berlin for a while before he left. This type of sefer, as you said, he had the background in Mikra. What style sefer? You mentioned that this is something that you use every week in your own Ramban learning. So what style sefer are we talking about with Koran Pnei Moshe?
It's someone who is digging to find the real pshat in the Ramban. He's not using the Ramban as a springboard to say what he wants to say. He's, to use the yeshivish sprach, he's muching to understand the Ramban. And he does that with a original way. He's able to find a new take on it. It's not at all the Rav Hutner style machshava. It's just pshat in the Ramban based on a broad background of mikra, of language, a lot of focus on language, and with a little bit of a fresh look at things, be able to take a new take. He also, there's something that's unique about the Sefer, which is his ability to look at things in a klolistic way. As a matter of fact, one of the ideas I had for the Sefer was he gives us many klolim throughout the Sefer. This is the derech of the Ramban. This is the derech of Unkelis. This is the derech of Rashi. This is the derech of Psukim. This is the derech of Chazal. This is the derech of the Even Ezra. And we collected all those klolim in the beginning of the Sefer, to reference where he discusses it, and you can see a lot of things that how he was able to look at things in a more macro way and see the derech of Chazal and Rishonim and Psukim and get things and take things out of it. He also had a very strong critical sense, like dating when certain svarim came out and what Ramban had access to. As a matter of fact, this is something where Rav Moshe Greenis is quoted in the pretty much the standard edition of the Medrash Rabbah. If you look at there's an introduction by the Meratz Chayes published in Zech Chanoich Vakshal Medrash Rabbah. Over there, he talks about which midrashim came out in which order. There's not all of the people think of the Medrash Rabbah there's a sefer called Medrash Rabbah. There's no such thing. Like Shmuel Kunda famously said, there's no such thing as a watermelon tree. There's no such thing as Medrash Rabbah. There's Bereshis Rabbah, Shmois Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah, Bamidbar Rabbah, and Dvorim Rabbah. Those are 5 different svarim, and they date at different times. Now the content perhaps goes back from Chazal, but the authorship or the compilation of it came on later on. And if you look at the Akdama of Meratz Chayes, there's a note over there quoting Rav Greenis, because his introduction to Sefer Bamidbar, he talks about the Ramban's relationship with the Medrash Rabbah, and he quotes the Tzir Chayes, who says that there's no Medrash Rabbah on Shemois Bamidbar, that there's no Medrash Rabbah of Shemois Bamidbar Dvarim, meaning there's no Shemois Rabbah, Midbar Rabbah, Dvarim Rabbah quoted by any Kadman, and even the Alkut Shemaini doesn't bring it down. And he says it's true that the Rabbi Seinu Atzarfatim, which is the Balei HaTosfos, only bring from Bereshis Rabbah and Vayikra Rabbah. And he says, I remember when I learned in the yeshiva, my friend of my youth, Hagoin Rabbi Aaron Shechter, there originally it says Shlita, and we obviously changed it to Zatzal, asked him about the Ramban and Baba Basa Kuflam Dalar Man Aleph, that it says over there, the Gemara says Rabbi Yechon Mezakir Leinich Mikra Mishnah Agadis, and the Rashbam says, what's Agadis? Tanchuma, Bereshis Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah. So what happened to all the others? So Aaron Shechter asked his friend, Rav Moshe Greenis, he says, what about all the other rabbis? Why is he only mentioning Bereshis Rabbah and Vayikra Rabbah? So he told him this is a support to the Meratz Chayes, who writes the Mavoy to Medrash Rabbah, that these other Svarim did not exist. The Kadmonim didn't have it. But he ends off, and this is the question that's quoted over there in the standard edition of the Medrash Rabbah. He says, "Timehani ala goyim Meratz Chayes," that he says there's no Shmois Rabbah and Medrash Rabbah, Bamidbar Rabbah quoted in any Kadmon. The Ramban brings them very often in his Sefer HaTorah, and he gives a list of all the times the Ramban brings it. He brings a Parshat Tzava, and he says Verisi b'Medrash Rav ve'Eila Shmois. He gives a list of 5 places where Ramban does quote these things. But he says, if you take note, the Lashon Ramban in the beginning of Bamidbar, it would seem that only when Ramban got to Sefer Bamidbar did he gain access to Bamidbar Rabbah, because the Lashon Ramban of there is Shuv Motzasi b'Bamidbar Rabbah, Bamidbar Sinei Rabbah. So it's mashma that Ramban first went through his Pirush, and only later did he get access to this Sefer. So even though he's maintaining that the Ramban had access to Bamidbar Rabbah, it only came later. So this gives you a certain sense of his historical sense, of his critical sense of Rav Moshe Greenis. But the classic piece that you'll find over here wouldn't be a piece like that. You'll find a lot of that. But the classic piece is simply understanding the Ramban. I'll give you a very short thing, what I recently mentioned in the Chumash here. It says, V'ra'o hakoyin b'yoyim hashvi v'hine hanega omad be'enov. So what does it mean, v'hine hanega omad be'enov? So I'm not going to go through the whole piece on the Ramban, but you could read the Ramban and you won't necessarily get all this. But if you look at Rav Moshe Greenis' Pirush Ramban, he'll break it down to you that Ramban is telling us there's 3 definitions to the word Einov. The word Einov can mean color, like ve'einoi ke'ein habdoilach, or ke'ein ha'kerech hanoira. The word Einoi could mean lashon of be'en, that it keeps its consistency or it keeps its shape. That's Amad Hanega Be'enav, can either mean it retained its color or retained its shape and its size. And then there's a third pshat that the word Be'enav is not referring back to the Nega, it's Amad Hanega Be'enav of the Kohen. And he explains, the Ramban brings a proof from the Teres Kohanim that the word Be'enov refers back to the Kohanim, because first of all, a nega, if it means the color of the nega, it should be Be'enoi. Or if it refers to the shape, it should have been Be'enoi, because there's no 2 eyes to a nega. But if it refers back to the Kohen, it's Amad Hanega Be'enov of the Kohen. And then he explains that the Ramban's position is that you don't have to measure the nega to see that it spread or didn't spread. It's enough that the Kohen's perception was that it spread. He doesn't have to make, and then he compares that to the opinion of the Tur Ha'oruch B'Shem the Rosh, which says, people are not aware of this, but some people are not aware of this, that Rashi says famously Chumash that what do we do after the first week? We lock up the Mitzayra, the Hizgiroi HaKoyin, you lock him up. But the emes is, nowhere in Masechtas Nagorim does it say that you lock up the Kohen. You don't lock him up. You lock up the Mitzayra. And also the lashon of the pasuk is his gear is going on the nega. So you're locking the nega, not the Mitzayra. It should have said his gear a Mitzayra, not the nega. And therefore the Torah brings b'shem the Rosh that v'hizgira means that you go and look at lashon mizgeres. You frame the nega, you make like a line around it to check the next week if it spread or if it didn't spread. And then so now we already have a machlokes, because the Ramban is saying it's on by nega be'enav. No, as long as the Kohen's perception, it seems like that it didn't spread, that's good enough. But if you look according to the Rosh, it has to be mamish, that you have to make a line and see if it spread. It didn't spread. You can't just rely on your perception. And then he quotes the Tchilas Mordechai, one of his famous one of his favorite svarim, that says that Rashi, but it is a port Rashi from the Medrash Rabbah, this is Vayikra Rabbah in this case, that it says in the Medrash, Basar v'dam chavish beis asum, HaKadosh Baruch chavish beis asum, shenema v'zgirei HaKohen, is a right to Rashi. So here's a very good classic, if you want to use this this is a classical Koran Pnei Moshe. Gut upgelernt Ramban. He really understands the Ramban well and explains how he clarifies what Ramban is trying to do over here. At the same time, he compares it to other Rishonim, which is a very interesting shaila. Does what Vizgiri HaKoyin means, and he also has a language part of it, how ayin can mean this and ayin can mean that. So that will be a classic piece. The piece on Midbar Rabbah would be more how he goes into Klolim, and this piece would be more of a classic piece. But can I share one more thing, which is that another element that you'll find in the Sefer, which is a little bit almost, you could say, out of the box kind of things, and you'll find that also as well in the Sefer. I really, really find this fascinating. Over Ben Azmanim on Pesach, I was reading the Great Shurim debate by my friend Rabbi Aaron Otis. And I was reading a piece, and in the middle I said, 1 second, I saw the exact same conclusion in the Koran Pnei Moshe. What is it? I'll say it real quickly so people should be able to follow what the point in the Koran Pnei Moshe is. he says like this. Rabbi Notice says that in Chizkiyahu's cave, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have visited Chizkiyahu's cave, so some people go with the children and they splash in the water. But if you look at it more of a learning experience, the cave, there was a famous inscription that was found in the cave, which says that Chizkiyahu's people, they originally made the cave to Chizkiyahu wanted to divert the water so that the Sancheriv shouldn't be able to have a water supply when he besieges Yerushalayim, and that was the purpose of Chizkiyahu making digging this cave to divert the Shiloach into away from the those who can come to siege the city. And there's an inscription that says that the cave is 1,200 amas long. Now, if you measure the cave, now we know how long an amma is. The great shiur and debate of how long an amma is. If you measure the cave, now we know how long an amma is. An amma comes out based on this measurement, roughly, I'm not giving exact measurements, but just say 42 centimeters long, something like that, would be the measurements of an amma based on that measurement. Another very important archaeological finding is on the Har HaBayis. They found a remnant of the original Har HaBayis from Bayis Sheni, and based on that remnant, which is a step that was found, a little step which was not, because it wasn't 100% straight, they noticed that it was really not a step, it was really part of a wall, and they were able to measure the Tov Kuf Amon, the 500 amma by 500 Tov amma of Har HaBayis. Now we're able to identify with quite a strong measure of certainty exactly what the Tov amma was. But based on those measurements, instead of an amma being about 45 centimeters, it's like 52 centimeters. So which one is it? Which one is the amma? So the big chidush, which was actually Leon Rittemeyer in his book The Quest, Revealing the Temple Mount, he brings this, and Rabbi Notice is just quoting from that book. He says that in ancient Egypt there were two kinds of ammas. There was a regular amma and there was the royal amma. And the regular amma, the cubit, the normal, the typical cubit was 45 centimeters. Again, numbers, I'm dropping decimals. And the royal cubit was like 52 centimeters, and that was called the royal cubit. I said, 1 second, I've seen this before, this exact same distinction, but this time it was not by studying archaeology, but Rabbi Greenis on a pasuk in Dvarim. The pasuk says like this. The pasuk says, "Hine arsay erez barzel," talking about Oig Melech HaBashan, "Teisha amas arkoi va'arba amas rochba ba'amas ish." Rashi says, "Ba'amas ish, ba'amas oig." And Ramban says the same shot as well, which is a pella, because every person has 3 amas, and if the definition of amma is from your elbow till the end of your middle finger, which is called the amma. That's the measurement of an amma. If Oig Melech HaBashan has the amma of Oig, meaning his 9 amas in his own amma, he's very disproportionate. Every person has 1 amma for his 3 amas. But if Oig Melech HaBashan, his eres means his height was 9 amas, and his hands, so he looked like a little penguin with hands sticking out on the side. It doesn't make any sense. There's so much apella. And the Evan Ezra asks the kasha. So he says that the Rabbi Greenis writes, it's well known that the Umois and also the Yidden would make their midos bigger l'kovid the melech. Again, the royal cubit. That's the concept of the royal cubit. And he writes that he visited England. He was in the Royal Museum, and over there he saw that there's a royal gallon, a royal quart, and he saw there's also a royal foot, which is 13 or 14 inches. It's called the king's foot. And he says that's the pshat. Ba'amas ish, if you look in Unkelis says ba'amas melech. So amas melech means the royal amma. So the same explanation that the archaeologists figured out by measuring the Har HaBayis versus Chizkiyahu's cave, Rabbi Greenis comes to that conclusion just by analyzing the psukim, and of course a visit to the British Museum helped as well, and coming to the same shot. So you'll have this kind of collection. I gave an example before, giving klolim of what in the derech of the Rishonim and Chazal. He'll have more like a critical sense of what the Ramban had access to, Ramban didn't have access to. But the typical piece would be, like I gave example, learning the psukim, understanding meaning of words, going through Shittas Rishonim, and there's a lot of halachic discussions that he leads in from the understanding Ramban into a halachic discussion from there. Many, he's a great Talmud Chacham of halachic discussion that come off there. And finally, he's able to do something out of the box as well, like by bringing some knowledge he has in the British Museum into understanding the pasuk of Ba'amas Ish.
A couple of things to comment on what you were just saying. First of all, I noticed the Great Shurim debate. There's an episode on Svarim Chatter with him talking about that book, and also the Great Zemanim debate as well. Also, talking about the Midrashim, going back to that part of the discussion with the Midrashim, I think Bamidbar Rabbah is the newest one, if you will, the most recent one, actually. And yeah, the Medrash Rabbah, eventually I'll get to an episode or a series about Medrash, but the Medrash Rabbah spans centuries. It's not just one Medrash Rabbah. There's a great book on Medrash called by Anat Rezel, Movil Medrashim, by I think Michalel Herzog. It's very hard to get here, but that goes through every Medrash, gives you a little snippet, a little discussion of it, and that's a great book that really talks about Medrash. Now, getting to this sefer, so you gave a couple of examples. I'm looking at, just flipping through. First of all, there's even a piece on Ibn Ezra, something we'll talk about in Ibn Ezra, so it's not only on Ramban alone. But what was done here to point out, which is because it's a commentary on the Ramban, so what's very nice in the addition here is that whenever you have a pasuk, you'll have the pasuk. So in bold, you'll have the pasuk. Then you'll have the text of Ramban, or the piece I'm looking at, the text of Ibn Ezra. It'll say exactly what it is. So usually it's the Ramban, text of Ramban. And then it'll have Rabbi Greenis's Pirish, his own commentary, Koran Pnei Moshe, on that Ramban. Also, you added in the side headers. There's a little short synopsis on the side. Any nice as far
those
as
are based on Rabbi Greenis' original headers that was just in front of the Sefer, and we put them on the side.
Yeah, there's the original footnotes. There's some new footnotes now. You bring down some footnotes on the bottom and other things. Now, another thing that we should point out about the Sefer is I'm sure many are familiar with the classic Ramban from Masada of Kook. I think probably when Rabbi Greenis wrote this Sefer, it was more in use than it is today. But Rabbi Chaim Dov Chevel edited many Rishonim, many Svarim, but the Ramban for Masada of Kook was one of the classical works that he edited. Actually, I think it's the only one of the Rabbi Chevels from Masada of Kook has reissued. All they did was retypeset it, give it a nice new crisp font. I don't think they changed anything. I don't think they incorporated Rabbi Greenis' corrections that we're going to get to. But Rabbi Greenis has a number of corrections and comments on Rabbi Shevel throughout the Sefer. And then in the back, he also has a small nisbach discussing that as well.
So this was a very sensitive issue dealing with his critique of Rav Shevel. And there's very good debate between two Chachmei Deirenu about who the Ravid was. One argues the Ravid is, we know a lot of people refer to the Ravid as the Baal HaSagis. And the other Chacham argued back, he said the Ravid is not the Baal HaSagis. What does the Meiri call the Ravid? The Meiri calls the Ravid the G'dolei HaMefarshim. The Ravid wrote Pirushim on the entire Shas. And unfortunately, a lot of his Pirushim, probably because of Rashi's popularity and because of the Churban of a province, which happened earlier than other Churbanis, the Galus province, and therefore they disbanded. So we lost a lot of there are still some, we know that from the Shita Mekubetzes brings a lot of
we have Avodah Zarah.
We have an Avodah Zarah, and we have Baba Kama and other Masechtas. But a lot of the Ravid's Pirushim were lost for posterity. But nevertheless, we know that he was the Gedolei HaMefarshim. All the Rishonim quote him constantly, and no Rishonim quote him as the Baal HaSagis. One of the things the Ramban did, the Ravid did, Derech Agav, was that he wrote some notes on other Rishonim, and he argued with them. Fortunately or unfortunately, or the Hashgacha was that way, that was what became the most popular works of the Ravid, and therefore people perceive the Ravid as Baal HaSagis. To give a good mashal, imagine if Chas v'Shalom, the Chazanish Svarim, would be lost, and all we would have is Gilyonis on Reb Chaim, and a few other Svarim that the Chazanish wrote Gilyonis on. I will call the Chazanish the Baal HaSagis. That's who he was. He wrote Chazanish. Derech Agav, he wrote some HaSagis and other Svarim. So it doesn't serve the author well to be known as the Baal HaSagis. But sometimes, and I can give you another example of a mutual friend of ours who wrote a sefer that way, but I won't mention which sefer. Very often a person, the mechaber, is driven to write something because he sees something wrong and he wants to correct what was wrong. And that drives him to write a sefer. So Rabbi Greenis, his drive to write on the Ramban was to correct the mistakes that he perceived in Chevel's work. Because Chevel, while he did a nice job and he was the first one to do it, but there are some inaccuracies and mistakes that Rabbi Greenis felt were there, and that was the fire in his belly that made him write his sefer. And therefore, there was a lot of rischa deraisa, and it was a bit sharp-worded critique that he wrote both in his introduction. He gave a whole list of all Chevel's mistakes, and throughout the Sefer, he wrote very sharply against Rabbi Chevel. I convinced the family, and I think it was the right thing to do, that anything which is not relevant to Pshat, in other words, it's just a editorial of Rabbi Chevel's personality or Rabbi Chevel's abilities, that we can take out of the Sefer, because it doesn't lend any te'elis for the Sefer at all. But we left anything of content. He argues a point, we left it there. Regarding his critique, his general critique of Chevel and list of mistakes, I recommended, and they followed my recommendation, to put that in the back of the Sefer, send it the front of the Sefer. And the purpose of this wasn't to censor anything. The purpose of it was to restore the Rabbi Greenis to become Gedolim Meforshim rather than the Baal Hasagis. And a lot of people associate the Sefer with his arguing on Rabbi Chevel, and what came out of that was a beautiful Sefer in Ramban, which you can forget the fact that he had arguments with Rabbi Chevel. It's just the fact that he was Mefarish Ramban so beautifully is what's worth saving for posterity. Also, his children did tell me that in the end of his life, he did express some kind of regret of being so sharp with Rabbi Chevel, and therefore we feel justified in taking out those sharp barbs which are not relevant to Pshat.
I'll mention a personal story about Rabbi Chevel, is that when I was in fourth year Beis Medrash in Philadelphia Yeshiva, I learned the Shmuel Kamenetsky, and on Thursday mornings, and I would pick different things, probably, I guess, weirder Sfarim than other people. I guess I was always weird Sfarim-wise already at that point. I learned Barbanel and Perkei Avos one time. We learned basically Kim. Okay, that was pretty standard. So it was before Rosh Hashanah, and I asked Shmuel, I said, could we learn the Ramban's Drush on Rosh Hashanah? So I brought in the Kisvei Ramban from Rabbi Chevel. So brother Shmuel opens up and says, we have to read the Mavoy first. So he proceeded to read the whole thing first. And he tells me, Rabbi Chevel, I was a Tyreed. That's just, and we read the whole thing with all the additions and everything, and then we finally sat down. I don't think we ended up finishing the Rosh Hashanah. I don't remember if it was one or two times. I don't remember how quickly before Rosh Hashanah I brought it up, but just that was my little story with Rav Shmuel, just over about Rabbi Chevel. Now, turning back to the Sefer, something else interesting that I thought was cute, but really keeping in with the Mechaber. In the last page here of the Sefer, you have Hakdosha Mimadura Kama, and it's all the original people that gave money for the Sefer. And it says in the bottom, the author and publisher request and require that anyone publishing this work in the future include the names of the donors who finance its first printing, which is a nice thing, because people always ask this, like, what's going to happen? I gave a Sefer, what happens? And I'm still in charge of my grandfather's shul, Chavalim the Torah in Lakewood, and people there, it's my parents really paid for the library, but we have old Sfarim, we have to get rid of. People say, well, I'm going to donate a Sefer, and what's going to happen? You're going to get rid of it. That's just donating a Sefer, not even paying for an actual Madura. But here you have someone paying for an actual Madura, and this comes up all the time. What happens? You put it in, and then just gone. When the next person finances the next printing, you remove it. So here, you have the pages printed in the new edition.
Yes, that was the right thing to do. If it says in the Sefer that you have to always reproduce it, we reproduced it.
Okay, so what is the impact or the legacy of the Koran Pnei Moshe and Rabbi Greenis?
I would read to you there's a Sefer HaPardis that came out in Tovshin Memches. There is a book review about the Sefer, or maybe like a book announcement by Betzal Naor. Betzal Naor considered himself somewhat of a Talmud of Rabbi Greenis, and he wrote a short article about the Sefer Koran Pnei Moshe back then in Tovshin Memches in 1988. He says, is there any Sefer so beloved by Lamdanim? He wrote in Hebrew, I'm reading in English, like the Ramban. He says, a Lamdan who wants to be Parash Shavua, where does he head to? He heads to the Ramban. He'll find the Shakel of Ataria in the world, which talks the dialogue and conversation of a real Lamdan. He says, therefore, it's not a pella that this Mechaber, referring to Rabbi Greenis, so Migdoili HaToyre Ba'artz Zabris Hayoim, Kishegi Azmani Lovi Lakan V'Talmud B'Yodi. When he wanted to publish something, he tied his lot, or he tied his destiny with Rav Moshe ben Bar Nachman. And there's many reasons for this, other than just the Gzeir Shav. They both have the same name, Moshe. And he says, first of all, he says there's a connection between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. And that is a very good way of putting this Sefer, because Rabbi Greenis is as comfortable in the intricacies of Halacha and Torah Shebal Peh as he is, what I mentioned before, with a strong background in Mikra. And the Sefer definitely builds that bridge between the two of them. He says it's very nadir ma'od, means very rare in this time to find someone who's Baki Bishas from the caliber of Rabbi Greenis, who's also Baki in Tanakh, Ad Lahafli. And he refers the reader to Rabbi Greenis' explanation of Melchemes Ai and Sefer Yeshua. And he says, Rabbi Naor suggests that he has, can I have the nerve to suggest, says Rabbi Naor, that perhaps this was the Ramban's own agenda, that he wanted to bring together Kutchabrichu Shchinte, in other words, to bring together the Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat Peh, and Rabbi Greenis follows in that way. And he mentioned Rabbi Greenis, the Talmud of Chaim Berlin, which we discussed already, and he mentions Rabbi Greenis' position in Magen David, which was where he was where he actually had the position over there, and after he left Chaim Berlin. He also mentions Rabbi Greenis' Hasidic background. He stamms from Hasidim originally. And then he says that he's specialized. He says, Idan hitmachut, in the time of specialization. He says, Omed negedeinenu ish ha-renaissance. He says this Renaissance, that he went and he specialized in this topic. And he goes on to write how wonderful the Sefer is, and he gives them a bracha. That's a good way of describing the Sefer. I think that anyone who's serious about learning Ramban, if I may say, I myself find myself a serious student of Ramban. I really try to learn the Ramban, not just to use it as a way of giving a drasha, just to really understand what the Ramban wants. And if you're really interested in learning Ramban and being able to take it when Torah Shabbat Chsav, Torah Shabbat Chsav, Torah Shabbat Peh, Torah Shabbat Peh, this is the Sefer you want. It's refreshing, but it's also really trying to understand the Pshat. I said this a few times. I just want to emphasize it again.
You know, when we did the episode on Rapsajigoin, I asked you, who is the Sefer for? So you gave a refreshing answer there, and you said it's for anyone that knows more than Ramban and Parshas Boy. Because if you know just that, forget about it. It's not for you. And, you know, listeners comment to me. You ask this question all the time, and they say, oh, I think this Sefer is for everybody. And well, it's not always the case. So there you said it not. So this Sefer you just answered is for those that learn Ramban, which is very often, especially in Yeshiva Shavelt, many people learn Ramban, and in the world at large, Ramban al Torah is one of the most important foundational texts in Yiddishkeit, and not just a Pirish and Chumash. There's a lot there in Ramban. For those that don't learn Ramban, probably should learn Ramban. And so this is a real super commentary, if you will, on Ramban. I also want to mention that I will link to it in the show notes. It's available in Svarim stores from Ali Zayis. It's $25. It's a large Sefer. The Sefer is about 600 pages, almost 600 pages. There's a mafteach in here. You can find an index, and there's a lot of things in there.
I just want to mention, you say who it's for. First off, to give credit is due. The line about Ramban Soif Parshas Boy, that the original line was from Rabbi Yitzchak Lebovich from the Woodridge Shul, from the Chassidish, the Talmud of Satmarov in the Woodridge. He said that ain't it someone who tells you the Ramban at the end of Parshas Boy, you know he doesn't know any other Ramban. So I have to give credit to him for that line. And just to mention another connection with Hasidim, Rabbi Yaakov Koppel Schwartz, the Mechaber of Yaakov Ephraim, is one of the most prestigious svarim written on the Ramban al Torah. He wrote a Divrei Koran in the Hagdama to this Sefer. They were very interesting. They were pen pals. They never met in person, Rabbi Greenis and Rabbi Koppel Schwartz, even though they lived in the same city, but they would write to each other in the Pshat and the Ramban. And by the Shiva, Rav Koppel Schwartz came to be Menachem Avil. He says, I came to Menachem Avil, my friend, his children, that is, after he was Nifter, even though he never met him in person. And he felt so connected. I was Zoicha to give Rav Koppel Schwartz a copy of the Sefer. He was looking forward to it very much. And it's that's just to give you, it's not just for Yeshiva Sha'olim, it's for Chasidim, Yeshiva Sha'olim, anyone who's learning Ramban off an emes with a seriousness, this Sefer's for him.
I think the examples that you gave on this podcast alone show that it's not simply, it's hard to, you can't put the Sefer in a box, if you will. It's a wide-ranging Sefer, as you've mentioned, Ish HaRenaissance. It's a very wide-ranging Sefer from a real Talmud Chacham, someone who knew Ramban cold, as they say, and so it's a beautiful new edition that was put out by the family and through Ali Zayas. So I will link to that in the show notes for those interested in purchasing.
One thing to clarify for the listeners, anyone who is familiar with the original version of the Koran Pnei Moshe will know that it came out in two, you mentioned it came out in two svarim. And the way it came out wasn't like Bereshis, Shemois, Vayikra, and then it came out by Midbar Dvarim. The whole Sefer came out in the whole entire Chumash, and then he published it again with new pieces on, and sometimes additions to the old pieces. And what we did was we had to weld them together and connect the old and the new, the first edition, the second edition. And we had to sometimes add a few connective words so it can read as one long piece. We also added letters that he had Divrei Torah to people, notably Rabbi David Cohen from the Gvul Yaivitz. He was also very close to him. He also writes a biographical sketch about him in the Hagdama. And Rabbi David Cohen was nice enough to share his letters with his correspondence that he had with Rabbi Greenis. And part of the Sefer is also the Divrei Torah that Rabbi Greenis shared with him at the time.
Okay, well, thank you, Rabbi Shimon, for joining me once again on the podcast.
Thank you.